National Reconciliation Week. This is an annual celebration that builds upon the respectful relationships shared by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous peoples of all the cultures in these lands now called Australia. During National Reconciliation Week, all Australians are invited to learn more about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and histories, to share that knowledge and help us grow as a nation. We begin our time together acknowledging that we stand on the land of many traditional owners. Here in Canberra, I'm on Ngunnawal land. We pay respect to their elders. We acknowledge the memories of their ancestors and celebrate their continuing culture. We acknowledge the deep spiritual attachment and relationship of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to this country and commit ourselves to the ongoing journey of reconciliation. Although you are on mute, I invite you to join in our prayer for justice and reconciliation. God of wondrous possibility, take my story and my life. Give me courage to stand for justice. God of truth and love, take my bruised hands and feet. Give me strength and grace to stand for truth. God of safety and singing, take my mouth and my voice. Give me words to inspire and encourage. God of knowledge and creativity, take my whole being. Help me stretch, broaden and deepen. God of goodness and hope, take my connections and influence and help me stand for reconciliation and justice. Amen. It's my pleasure now to introduce our guest speaker for the day. Just a reminder that after the guest speaker, you will have the opportunity to have your questions answered. So there is a Q&A function you can use for this before we have a response from Dr. Angela McCarthy. Our guest today, and forgive my attempt at pronouncing this name correctly, our guest today makes it easy for us by calling himself Orobator, but his name is Agbonkhianmeghe Orobator. He is the Dean of the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University. Prior to this, Father Orobator spent 7 years as the President of the Jesuit Conference of Africa and Madagascar, leading the Jesuits on the continent where the order is growing most rapidly. A theologian originally from Nigeria with a doctorate from the United Kingdom, who specialises in ecclesiology, the study of the church. He is the author of a number of books, including Theology Brewed in an African Pot and The Pope and the Pandemic, Lessons in Leadership in a Time of Crisis. Father Orobator, you are very welcome.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and greetings to everybody who is joining this webinar. Just like to acknowledge, first of all, how delighted I am to be engaged in this conversation, which has been going on for a few days across 3 cities in Australia. And I'm grateful to people who facilitated this, the Loyola Institute at ACCCU, Sense of the Faithful at Newman College, St. Ignatius Parish, Toowong, North Sydney Parish, Catalyst for Change, ACCCR, but especially to Father Andy Nguyen and Michael Gill, who were really instrumental in inviting me to Australia. And the conversation is unfolding in the context, of course, of the Synod and Synodality. which I have the privilege of being a part of as a delegate and a voting member from the continent of Africa. But as I looked at the title for our webinar, it says Towards Promoting Theology. And this is the title of a text that Pope Francis published in November of 2023, which is a text which was issued by Pope Francis as what is called a motu proprio, that is of his own volition, impulse, kind of a personal postcard, but which focused on designing or developing a new approach to theology. And I wondered, why the organizations of this conversation chose to focus on Ad Theologiam Promovendam, to give it its proper Latin title, to promote theology. And I would say a bit about that, but also try to link it with the Synod on synodality, because I think there is a connection between the two, because the framing of the question, for which I take no responsibility, seems to suggest two things. There's a Synod on synodality, there's a document on promoting theology. But let me just say a few things about the document itself and what it really invites us to. Because the subtext of this title is, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for us? Well, as I mentioned, Pope Francis, that is inviting us to take a new approach to theology. And what is this new approach? Essentially, he's asking us to take context seriously. Context, that is our situation, our circumstance, to take this seriously in trying to articulate our understanding of who God is, but also our understanding of what God expects from us. So context becomes the important element that he's inviting us to focus on. And you might wonder, why is this important? Well, as I think about it and as I reflect on this document, I realize that it didn't just come from out of the blue, as if there were no precedents to it. In fact, there are several. When you look at the way Pope Francis has articulated his vision of what the church should be like, you begin to realize that this document did not just come from nowhere. It's actually a crystallization, a distillation of elements that Francis considers important when it comes to doing theology and when it comes to, imagining what it means to be a church. If we go back to the beginning of his pontificate in 2013, one of the very first documents he issued was Evangelii Gaudium. And there he already had a vision of what he imagined the church could be. For example, in that document, Evangelii Gaudium, he focused a lot on the importance of mercy. The importance of mercy as a defining characteristic of our community called church. That in a way we are purveyors of mercy. We facilitate the encounter of people with the face of God in Christ, which is mercy. And that was a very important element of his vision of church in that document. The other thing that comes out very strongly was Francis invites the church to be a community that goes forth. A community that is not simply referencing itself or simply interested in protecting itself or its reputation, but a community that goes forth. And in fact, the way he frames it, he writes very clearly, and I'm quoting now, he says, "I prefer a church which is bruised, a church which is hurting and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined to clinging to its own security. That's a very striking statement about his vision for the church. If we fast forward 2 years after this, we come to 2015. And in 2015, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Synod of Bishops, Francis articulates a vision for the church as a synodal church. He makes this statement about the kind of church he believes God is calling us to become in the third millennium. And he stated very categorically that the journey of synodality is the journey that God wants from the church in the third millennium. Very categorical. And he went on to explain what this church looks like. What does a synodal church look like in the imagination, in the vision of Pope Francis? Francis said, and I quote, "A synodal church is a church which listens and which realizes that listening is more than simply hearing. It is a mutual listening, a reciprocal listening in which everyone has something to learn. The faithful people, the College of Bishops, the Bishop of Rome, all listening to each other and all listening to the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, in order to know what the Spirit says to the church." This was how Francis framed his vision of synodality. And you can imagine already the radical change he is envisioning here. A church which listens. A mutual listening in which everyone has something to learn. It doesn't say well, everyone has something to say, but everyone has something to learn. Now, in that same year, and this is my third point, Francis wrote a letter to the Grand Chancellor of the Pontifical University in Argentina. It was the 100th anniversary of this institution. And again, he talks about his signature theme of mercy, reminding us that our theological speculations are totally worthless if they are not about mercy, God's mercy. And he goes on to say that we are called to live on the frontiers. That is, to meet the needs of people where they are in an understandable and meaningful way. He even goes on to say we have to be careful about engaging in a theology that is exhausted in academic dispute, or one that looks at humanity, he says, from a glass castle. Theology has to be rooted, he says, in the life and reality of people. So when we go back to this document then, Francis is actually inviting us to embrace a new approach to theology. And what does this entail, this new approach? And I think this is where we begin to enter into the domain, the field, the sphere of synodality. Francis suggests that when we do theology, we have to start from a place of listening. And listening in the sense of paying attention to reality, to context, to those elements and circumstances that define the situations of people. Francis suggests that it is possible that our theology can be a catalyst for the church that goes forth. A catalyst that empowers, enables the church to actually go out in the streets as a field hospital, as a practitioner, as a purveyor of mercy. In fact, Francis actually envisages a theological enterprise that allows us to imagine a church that is comfortable in dwelling in those spaces where the people of God experience the reality of their lives. This is the kind of theological enterprise he's calling us to, and which is also indicative of the vision of church that is calling us to. So what is it? What's in this for us? What does this mean for us? I'm going to mention 4 things which I think are critical, not only in understanding Francis's vision for theological scholarship, but also for beginning to understand his vision of what the community called church ought to look like in this change of eras or epochs. The first element is what I call encounter. Encounter. Of course, we're probably, many in the audience will be familiar with the letter of Pope Francis, apostolic letter of Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, but I won't go into that because encounter is certainly, a culture of encounter is at the heart of that document. We're talking about his vision for the church and theology here. Francis invites us to really consider the work we do as theologians as a call to encounter. That is, to position ourselves in a web of relationships with other forms of knowing, of knowledge, other disciplines. In other words, that when we do theology, when we engage in the work of theologizing, we're actually positioning ourselves in what I call, this is my term, an open circle, in which we're able to enter into dialogue with other disciplines, whether philosophical, scientific, humanistic, artistic, that are also keen on understanding the meaning of what it means to be human. So encounter becomes important in any theological enterprise. Encounter allows us to develop a culture of dialogue where traditions can meet, where disciplines can interact, where different forms or approaches to knowledge or methodologies can inform one another. That's encounter. Already, anybody who is familiar with the Synod, or rather the idea of synodality, would understand why this is an important element. Synodality is about encounter. And you don't encounter from a distance, from a safe distance. You encounter one another, others, in close proximity. Synodality is, for me, is precisely that open circle where we can drift in and drift out, but always seeking encounter. Remember Francis's vision for synodality, which he announced in 2015, always seeking those moments of mutuality, of reciprocity, where everyone has something to learn from the other. Encounter. The second element that I take away from this approach that Francis calls us to is vulnerability. Vulnerability. Initially, when I reflected on this just about a week ago, as I was putting my thoughts together, I was focusing more on the idea of solidarity. But as I thought about it, I realized I think the call is really to vulnerability. And why do I think it's a call to vulnerability? Because Francis invites us to dare to step out of our comfortable niches. In other words, to stop looking to simply protect our comfortable personal or communal niches which shelter us from the misfortune of humanity that surrounds us. Instead, he invites us, when we do theology, to actually enter into the reality of other people's lives. And when we do that, Francis says, and I quote, our lives become wonderfully complicated. Wonderfully complicated. And we experience intensely what it is to be a people and to be a part of a people, end quote. Our lives become wonderfully complicated. And anybody who has been involved in the Synod over the last 3 years, as I have been, I know that the process has become wonderfully complicated. And precisely because it calls us to enter into the reality, the experience of other people's lives. And that can be messy. And that's not always neat. No. In fact, the way Francis describes it in this document, he says, enter into the maelstrom of human misfortune. Or to put it even more mildly, enter into the reality of people's lives. And I say this is a form of being vulnerable. Because in entering into people's lives, we're called to take off our shoes, to drop our defenses, and to walk and journey together. By listening, engaging in dialogue, and being open to discerning together what God's will is for God's own church. And that's an experience that can become wonderfully complicated in the sense that it renders us vulnerable. And as a Jesuit, I believe that space of vulnerability, that's where the Spirit begins to act. And so when we think of this in terms of synodality, there is something beautiful about this idea of entering into a journey that can be wonderfully complicated. In other words, I don't have the answers before the journey. I don't even know what the path is. We make the path by actually walking it. We make the path by actually working the journey. And that's vulnerability. If I were used to having my securities, holding on to what keeps me safe, the process of synodality could become quite threatening. And the vulnerability it calls for, that Francis invites us to, can become quite unsettling. Now I go to my third element, which I draw from my reflection on this document on promoting theology in the context of the Synod on synodality. My third element, I title imagination. Imagination. When Francis describes what he thinks the new approach to theology should be in this text, he says, I'm asking you to undertake a paradigm shift. I'm asking you to engage in a courageous cultural revolution. I'm asking you to become engaged in a fundamentally contextual theology, a fundamentally contextual theology. Now, a paradigm shift, a cultural revolution, what does that entail? Well, of course, that would entail courage, true, but above all, that entails imagination. Imagination. And Francis actually references another text, which is a text on theological studies in ecclesiastical universities and faculties, that describes theology as being in a sort of a providential cultural laboratory. Can you imagine that? Theology as a sort of providential cultural laboratory. And you have to ask, what happens in a laboratory? Of course, experimentation, investigation, analysis, and creativity, of course. And imagine if we're actually taking this on board in how we do theology and thinking of ourselves as people who work in a laboratory. That's a laboratory which is made up of the realities of people's lives. Remember the maelstrom of human misfortune? If we were actually working in this mode, what new things might we conceive of and create together? What innovative responses might we discern and design to build a more inclusive synodal church? What fresh insights might we discover and deepen to renew theology and the community called church in a synodal manner? And so when I think of synodality, again, imagination is critical, because imagination is the stuff with which the Spirit works. That's material for the Spirit to work, imagination. And so entering into this path of synodality becomes an opportunity to imagine what new ways we can become the church that is out there on the streets, bruised, hurting, yes, but actually serving, as Francis would say, as a field hospital, a purveyor of mercy for the people of God. And so there's something exciting about this invitation to synodality. And that is what I said, as I said, it's a call to exercise our imagination. Francis is always keen on reminding us that, look, the most important protagonist of synodality is the Holy Spirit. And what does that mean? That the Holy Spirit is the protagonist. That spirit which blows wherever the Spirit decides to blow. That spirit that actually explodes the universe, or rather the world of the frightened disciples after the resurrection, who exploded their world and opened them to a whole universe of possibilities. That's the spirit of synodality. That's the spirit that works with imagination to create worlds unimaginable and unimagined. And I'll come to my final point, and that is discernment. Discernment. And again, as a Jesuit, I realized that once you start talking about the spirit or spirits, you need to be sure that you have the necessary skills to discern which of these spirits are of God and which are not. And so discernment is important. In other words, we don't have a fixed idea of where we are being led. We haven't predetermined the answers. We have no stock inventory of responses or answers to realities that affect people as persons, but also people as community, like our church. We don't have a stock inventory of answers. It's not a question of saying, well, as we have always taught, as the church has always taught, as the popes have. No, we are in the territory of trying to discern in common, that is, together as a community. And that requires the humility to grant agency to the other, the humility to grant attention to the other, and realize that the Spirit who animates us, the Spirit who inspires the church, speaks to us through many, many avenues, through many, many processes. So when Francis then invites us to pay attention to the reality of people's lives, or to the maelstrom of human misfortune, to areas where humanity is being defined, is actually inviting us to a process of discernment. And this, for me, is not only discernment as a task for theological reflection, is discernment as a task for ecclesial renewal. A church that discerns. Imagine a church that listens, a church that dialogues, a church that discerns together. What will that mean for us as a synodal community? So as I see it, encounter, vulnerability, imagination, discernment, these are key components of Francis's invitation to us to embrace a new approach to theology. But it's not just about theology. It's about what kind of church we desire to become. What kind of church is the Spirit inviting us to become? And that's where synodality becomes a critical element of what it means to be church today. Because I'm convinced that a synodal church is a church that facilitates encounters. Those encounters for listening, for dialogue, for discernment as a community, so that we might discover more and more what new paths God's Spirit is leading us. I believe that synodality is an invitation to become comfortable with our vulnerability. I know we are an institution as a church that has existed for 2,000 years, and so there are certain certainties that we've grown to expect. But synodality invites us to become comfortable with the possibility that we don't have the answers right yet. And that's not a bad thing. That's okay. And then, because we don't have the answers, we can exercise our imagination. Yeah, we can be creative, innovative, allow the Spirit to do new things. That's, passage from Scripture which says, behold, I am creating a new heaven and a new earth. That's the stuff of which the Spirit works. And then, as I said, finally, all of this invites us to be constantly discerning, but also discerning in a way that recognizes that ultimately, what is birth what is engendered, what is generated from this process of discernment is not necessarily going to be what I want, but really what God wants for us as a community. So I'd just like to leave it there and, see if there is any, I'm sure there's an opportunity for us to engage in conversation about some of these elements that I have pointed out. But again, just to say that I'm very grateful to be having this conversation, and to all the groups, Catalyst for Renewal, ACCCR, and so many others who've made this possible. Happy to engage in further conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Bardo. There's a few questions, and I'll just pick up on one or two. There's one concern expressed that in terms of the synodal process underway at the moment, that the second session of the synod, that the agenda itself might be inadequate. So I guess, what's your view on this? Is there any option to resist that, or to focus on a different approach? What's your understanding of how the process is actually working out and the agenda as we understand it for the next stage?
Thank you. Although I'm a member of the Synod, I have an invitation for the second session, but I do not have an agenda for the second session, so I couldn't speak to that. But I would say one thing, that what I am more and more keen on is to realize that the process is important. There's a synod on synodality. And so I really believe that if we continue to work on the process and hopefully get it right, we stand the chance of being positioned on a firmer footing, stronger ground to deal with whatever issue appears on our agenda. And that's why I spend a lot of time talking about encounter, vulnerability, imagination, discernment. All these are elements of process. So I'm sorry I couldn't speak to the agenda for now because I don't have it. Thank you. Thank you.
Another question is from someone who's involved in Jewish-Christian relations. So I'll read their question as it is. What and how does the incarnation in the person of Jesus and that context relate to an emphasis on context today? Are they related? Could the two contexts dialogue?
So can you repeat the last part of that?
Yes, could the two contexts dialogue? So I think the context, I'm not sure whether the context relates to Jewish-Christian relations or, yes, I'm not sure. The question's not quite clear to me either.
Yeah, I'm sorry that it's not clear what exactly the question is about. Maybe the person asking can reformulate it and resend it.
Yes, thank you. We'll invite Mary. You might like to refine that a little bit for us. Okay, I think you've already encountered this question on your visit to Australia before, but there's a comment that Pope Francis made on a recent CBS interview with regard to the diaconate and priesthood for women, where he said a quite definitive no to that issue. Do you have any comments about that and how it doesn't seem to match the spirit of synodality?
Yes, yes, I have a comment on that, and I've made several comments on that already. And first, to express my own shock, disappointment, discouragement. That was my initial reaction. But I will say two things in addition to that. as a Jesuit, I'm trained and I'm formed to put the best interpretation on people's proposition. And I'm trying to come to that point. And I'm not sure that I'm there yet. But the second thing I would say is that when I hear a statement like that, it's hard for me to really experience what that does to people. Because in a way, I'll have to reverse the scenario and imagine myself as a committed, faithful Catholic woman hearing that from someone who wields considerable authority. You know, I can imagine that that will come across as hurtful and demoralizing. And I've had all kinds of reactions from people that I'm in conversation with who have expressed such negative reactions of hurt, of disappointment, of discouragement. And I want to hope, and I say this with all due respect, that the Pope is definitely entitled to his personal opinion. But if we are true to the process of synodality, I want to believe that the Spirit, whose actions we are trying to discern in this process of synodality, will lead us to a place where each member of this community called church will feel welcome at home and therefore able to exercise the gifts and the charisms that the Spirit accords each and every baptized Catholic. That's my hope. So I still have my negative reactions, but I want to hold a space for hope in the synodal process, that we are able to engage with it, remain committed to it, in the hope that the Spirit would actually show us the path forward on this question, and not feel that the definitive, emphatic, categorical negative settles the question once and for all.
Thank you. That's a very wise and consoling response. There is a question here, and it says, if synodality is listening to context, which I think is essential, how does synodality subsume situation ethics?
How does synodality
subsume situation ethics?
Well, there's a question, the question references a particular approach to ethical reflection, situation ethics. But when we talk about situational ethics, we're looking at ways in which we make decision choices or consider options that are determined by the realities we face here and now in this particular situation. But synodality is not about making this or that choices. It's the experience itself of actually journeying together in a way that allows us to hear and to listen to all of the elements that informs the path that we're engaged on, or the path that we opt to take. So I think it's not just a matter of ethics, as in this issue or that issue or this point or that point. It's more about how we actually engage these issues in a way that allows us to hear one another, but also in a way that allows us to hear what the Spirit is saying to us as a community. So I'm always very cautious, even as I'm tempted to focus on particular issues, to remind myself that it's not about specific, contentious, complex issues. Synodality is actually about creating those processes that allows us to address those issues without becoming alienated from one another, which I think is something that I notice a lot, especially in my present context where there's deep polarization, across. We become so fixated on those, this is something I learned, since coming to North America, those things that are defined as hot button issues, of which there are many. And we will never be able to resolve them until we find a way to actually begin to speak to one another across our ideological positions. And that's why I think synodality is more a challenge for us than simply addressing issues that come from that comes from the challenge of making ethical choices about this or that point.
Thank you. Another question. Given these 4 characteristics, what is the role of tradition and who makes the decision in the method of synodality?
Thank you very much. That's a very important question about tradition and decisions. Well, I believe that as a community that has existed for a long time, we have accumulated ways of doing things over centuries. And we tend to label this tradition. But what we call tradition need not become simply curated museum pieces that we only wheel out for display when it comes to settling questions of contention amongst different ideological positions. I would like to think that what we call tradition is more dynamic than that. That we actually create tradition. We create tradition. In other words, drawing on the patrimony that we have received over time, we are able to discern even different new ways of encountering reality, of proclaiming the gospel, of witnessing to our faith. So I believe that tradition is important, but I also believe that we are not bound to the violence that can come from militantly wielding tradition simply to overcome what we consider to be a contrary position. I believe that as people of faith who really believe that God continues to work and act in this moment in time, in history, it's also part of our duty and responsibility to create tradition. I mean, when you think about synodality itself, the word doesn't appear in Vatican II. Synodality doesn't appear in Vatican II. Even as we look for theological antecedents, we go back to Acts chapter 15. But we name Acts chapter 15 as Synod. The people who were present didn't name it as Synod. Now that's an element of tradition being created. The whole experience of synodality is actually an example of how tradition is created. Yes, we've had the Synod of Bishops since 1965, but we're not talking about just punctual, periodic gathering to look at specific issues. We're talking about a whole new way of becoming church, a synodal church, a church that is able to journey together in a manner that is inclusive, that focuses on our awareness of and attention to what the Spirit is actually doing in our community today. So I believe that tradition is important, but I am also convinced that tradition is not simply a weight that weighs down on our ability to be imaginative, to be creative in terms of creating and recreating traditions for posterity. You know, decision that's an interesting one, because when you look at the rules for discernment, or at least the principles for discernment, I speak now as a Jesuit, it's very important to be aware of who makes the decision. We need clarity about the question. We need clarity about who participates, the criteria for participation, but also how the decision will be made and who is going to make the decision. Now, before jumping to who makes the decision, what is important is that, and this is a distinction that came up in the Synod, you know, there is decision making, there is decision taking. What processes informs the decision taking? Is it informed by consultation? Is it informed by inclusive dialogue? Is it informed by an interiority, a contemplation, a moment of experiencing God's presence in our lives that we call prayer? Does it involve all of these elements? So that process of decision making is as important as the process, the final outcome or the decision that is taken. So no matter who takes the decision or how the decision is taken, what is important from a synodal perspective, as I see it, is that we're able to all be part of a decision-making process. And I don't mean this only at the highest level. I mean this at every level in which, as a community, we are called to witness to our faith, whether that's in a small Christian community, a devotional group, a renewal group, a reform group, a parish, a diocese, an archdiocese. These are all places where we can become partakers of a decision-making process that respects the agency of each baptized Christian and the responsibility that each baptized Christian holds to contribute his or her views to this process.
Thank you. That's so optimistic and empowering. There are a couple of questions, I suppose, expressing some disappointment really about the church and whether it's capable of change. Is it too mired in factionalism? Is there too much conservatism? Is there too much fear? What comment would you like to make on the church's capacity to change?
Well, the question talks about fear, talks about conservatism, which I suppose also betrays the position of the person who is posing the question, because I think we have to be careful of what I call the danger of a single story. That means that, it's really not about one thing. We all come at this from different positions, different perspectives. And that doesn't mean that with the position I hold, whether it's labeled conservatism or liberalism or progressive or traditionalist, is the one that is most aligned with the will of God or the intention of the Spirit. So I think the church is capable of changing. And sometimes when we despair about whether or not it will change, it's because of the kind of idea we have about the church, usually as an institution. But what synodality is calling us to realize more and more, just as Vatican II did, is to realize that we have agency. In other words, if change is going to happen, we too must now begin to exercise our agency. Whether we understand that change as reform or renewal or conversion, all of that must come about because we are exercising our agency. And one of the things that I'm taking away from this synod on synodality, which is very strong in me now, is the recognition of the baptismal dignity of every Christian that precedes any arrogation of power or authority or ascription of privilege or perks or positions within the church. Before we were ordained, and I point to myself now, before we were ordained, we were baptized. That's fundamental. That's hugely significant. So when we talk about change in the church, of course, it's not going to happen if we're just thinking only of institutions, because institution of the type, which we call church, that has endured so many years of history and circumstances and situations, of course, the first rule is self-preservation. That's the first principle, self-preservation. Weather the storm. But if we're thinking more synodally of church, that is, that takes account of our agency, which is a grace from our baptismal dignity, of course, change can happen. And change is happening right now. If synodality is an expression of a dream of Vatican II, where we are living in that moment now, where we are seeing that dream being fulfilled, I believe that this process, this experience, this moment, however we categorize it, called synodality, will not leave the church the same it was. That's my hope, and that's my belief.
But there are some questions about how contextual theology might be worked out in practice. Can you give an example of where you can see this attention to context being taken seriously and what it might actually look like?
Well, what would contextual theology look like? I speak from a perspective of someone who spent all my life involved in a way developing that contextual theology. Here's what it looks like. It is not detached from reality. It actually takes account of reality. And if you think of, I would say, for example, the ultimate contextual theologian that I know is Pope Francis. The way he constantly calls us to embrace and engage with the realities of our times, like migration, like climate change, like war and peace. All of these are elements or aspects or examples of how contextual theology looks like. That the proclamation of the gospel, or rather our ability to articulate an understanding of faith that is coherent, that is authentic, is premised on the link that we draw between this faith and where people actually experience their humanity. Whether it's in the broken context of war, in the broken context of displacement, or in the broken context of climate change. All of this matter to how faith is conceived of and understood. Francis talks about tabletop speculators. Tabletop speculators, another way of saying armchair theologians, where it's all about abstractions, where it's all about, what I call theological inanities. It's just, it doesn't relate to anything other than what goes on in my head. And yet when Francis tells us about education, he says education is about the head, the heart, and the hands. That's the harmony that contextual theology seeks. That yet, yes, we engage with our intellectual tradition, the traditions of intellectual engagement in the church. We engage with scripture. We engage with magisterial teachings. But all of this makes sense to the extent that we're able to relate it to something that really matters to people. What Francis called the realities of people's lives. What is my eloquent, disquisition on the Trinity has got to do with someone who is trying to raise a family in the context of war or displacement of climate change? What does it mean? What does it matter? So I think there are many ways of conceiving of contextual theology, but ultimately does it relate to, does it illuminate, does it throw light on the reality of people's lives? Or is it just simply, intellectual satisfaction that we derive from just engaging in abstractions and more abstractions?
Thank you. Another question comes from someone who's using their imagination, and they're wondering whether the renewal of the church might lead us to become more like the early Christian communities.
I don't know. I think I am one to refrain from romanticizing the early Christian communities. Again, of course, there was something very special about the post-resurrection narratives that we read in Acts of the Apostles about how the community was shaped, about the egalitarianness of the community, about, so much that was going on, the excitement, just the energy, that was transforming, entire society from the proclamation of the apostles. I mean, there's a lot to celebrate there, but I just don't want to romanticize that. I don't think the invitation is to go back to a form of Christianity that predates everything we now know. I think the invitation is to go forth, to go forward. That is, to new things this is what I said about tradition. It's not about preserving or returning to the old. It's also about creating the new with the benefit of the experience we have had of the old. How do we create new things? So I think there is a lot to celebrate in the first Christian communities. There's a lot to celebrate there. But let's not forget that it's not about recreating moments in history that we sort of find to be defining for the history of the church, but it's about opening ourselves to new realities that are emerging before us as a community. I think that's why I find excitement That's where I find not in a return to some pristine context, but in the ability to engage in something that is potentially transformative for the church, for the world. And that's what gets me excited about synodality.
Barbara, do you have, there's a lot of appreciation for how sensitively you explored women's disappointment with the Pope's answer of no regarding diaconate, but there are some further questions about how greater inclusion of women might be fostered into the church. Do you have any comments about that, about how we might better read the signs of the times in our current theologizing, and how this might broaden women's role in the church of the future?
You know, personally, it's exhausting, I have to say, on a personal note. There's a line in the synthesis report from the first session of the Synod on Synodality, which says, you know, women are not the question. Women are not the problem. You know, it's exhausting when we keep, you know, acting as if that's the problem, that's the question. So that's why I said it's exhausting when we keep coming back to making this point that women are not the question, they're not the problem. If we could even use that category of problem, you know, I'm more of a problem by virtue of my status, you know, that I occupy than anybody else. So I hope that as a Christian community, as the church of the beloved disciples of Jesus Christ, that the path we're engaged in now, synodality, will lead us first to be more humble and listen to what the Spirit is saying to the church through the voices of every baptized Catholic, and that is every baptized Catholic. Francis never tires of saying todos, todos, todos. Well, if it's todos, 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 that can only mean one thing: everybody. And I think this is where sometimes I get, and I said I get exhausted, because sometimes the rhetoric can be stirring, can be inspirational, but the reality can be totally different. We can say todos, 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 but how does that include people who genuinely feel called to minister in the church, to minister to the gospel, the good news in the church, in the name of the gospel in the church? What does that feel like? It's not todos, todos, todos. There's still a lot for us to do to achieve that ideal of everybody. And I will say this again, and I have no difficulty in saying it, that, look, any organization, and I'm grateful for the opportunity I had to study a bit of business and realize that when you run an organization, you want your best talents. You want to be encouraging, you want to be promoting your best talents. And so I say that, look, any organization that deprives more than 50% of its membership the ability to contribute their giftedness, their wisdom, their insight to building and promoting this organization is a dysfunctional organization. I have no other way of describing it. It's a dysfunctional organization. And right now, as I experience it, and it's not just about, I'm not talking about just ordination. I'm talking generally about, being able to draw on the giftedness of this body called church. As long as we create barriers, we deprive ourselves of the gifts of the Spirit. And we have to take seriously the call of the Synod on synodality to co-responsibility, which really means that there is no longer a division of labor between, okay, lay people, lay women, lay men, you make Christ present in the world, clergy and bishops, you take care of the church. No, we're co-responsible for the mission of the church, which means we are also co-responsible for reforming, transforming, and renewing the church.
Amen. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Angela McCarthy. Angela, I'll just give a brief introduction. Angela is a lecturer in theology for the School of Philosophy and Theology at the University of Notre Dame in Fremantle, in Australia, at the Fremantle campus. Her current research interest is in New Testament scriptural theology and its connection with art, faith, and beauty. She's also published in the areas of liturgy, music, and education. Let's go now to Angela to hear her response. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Baitor, for your wonderful talk and particularly your answers to the questions. In being asked to respond to you, I've, of course, first of all, spent a lot of time with the document that Francis has written, his motu proprio, and concerning the promotion of theology, because I haven't yet read the statutes that it precedes, but however, having taught for a very long time theology in Australia, it speaks very clearly of the changes that I have desired, in fact, imagined. I particularly liked the 4 critical things that you spoke about in being able to understand Francis's vision of the church and his vision of the synodal church. And I also resonate very deeply with the position of women, obviously, because it is hurtful, it is painful, and it becomes difficult when there's a loud resounding no that seems to be in contradiction to the encouragement to synodality. When I was reading the motu proprio, in the very first part, I thought, if they want to do it effectively to make these profound cultural transformations, we have to be relevant in this change era, as Francis calls it, not a change of era, but a change era. And to be relevant, theology has to start from that experiential foundation. As you said, from a place of encounter. The profound cultural transformations will have to be carefully examined and researched in a particularly qualitative way, not sitting at a desk, to help understand how to respond then theologically that is relevant and accessible to our world. We have a problem with truth. Truth is no longer apparent in many of life's public faces. We have the speed of the AI transformation and the change in who people present themselves to be as individuals in this apparently woke world. Where is the truth? Fake news and deep fake videos and other images are everywhere. So what's true? Theology needs to come from a place of truth. And so in order to do that, I do agree with you that we have to open ourselves to vulnerability. We have to open ourselves to other people's lives. And as you say, that becomes wonderfully complicated. In paragraph 3, there was reference there to the epistemological and methodological rethinking. And that's really very, very true. As you said, Baitor, that people, theologians who remain locked into their own language, which is very difficult. When I first started studying theology, I had to have a dictionary by my side because the language was so profoundly different. So I think in relaying theology, we have to do it in an accessible way. So I think we have to radically change our theological education. We do have some limitations in Australia, and I don't know what the limitations are for you in North America. But in the last 10 years or more, theological education has been vastly diminished in Australia. With the corporatisation of tertiary education, it's not possible to hold small groups of people who are interested in a niche area in theology, for instance, feminist spirituality. Australian universities have had to radically increase the cost of art degrees, and that includes theology, as they're considered not valuable by the government for the advancement of industry and economics and the other things that are of governmental interest. And that's even though 70% of our politicians in Canberra have arts degrees. Rethinking the method of teaching and its value will have to be the starting point. As a young woman in the 1970s in Sydney, I was unable to do a theology degree because such degrees were reserved for men only, particularly seminarians. Women were not expected to be able to make a contribution or to study in this area or to be productive or useful in the world of theology. For me, it wasn't until 1992, when Notre Dame opened up in Fremantle, that I was able to do a theology degree. That's probably horrifying to you from North America, where you've had a long tradition of women being welcome in universities, and you have some extraordinary women theologians who have contributed enormously to the world of theology. Even then, when I did get to do theology, I was advised by my professor not to do my PhD in theology because as a Catholic married woman, I would never get a job. That didn't prove to be true. Fortunately, things do change. In the paragraph 4 on theological reflection, I think that brings out what you referred to as vulnerability. And at this point, I'd like to offer two contrasting forms of theological explanation. One is Mark Cardinal Welle's book, Mystery and Sacrament of Love, A Theology of Marriage and the Family for the New Evangelization, which he published in 2015. It's been described by other reviewers as a rich theological reflection, as a magisterial panorama of church teaching on marriage and the family, and rich in substance and comprehensive in scope. I also reviewed this book, and while I was quite awed by the extent of the vastly rich systematic theology, I also felt that it would not be at all useful for parish priests and couples preparing for marriage. It will need considerable translation for the theological concepts to be brought into a lived reality. Vulnerability as a theologian would be required. Having been married myself for 50 years and being a theologian, I can translate it, but even then, it's hard to bring those concepts into the reality of married life. The other thing that was astounding was that he used exclusive language, referring constantly to men and man, and only occasionally referring to man and woman. If this theological expertise had begun with the experience of marriage through qualitative research or the theologian's own experience, the outcomes would have been vastly different and possibly much more useful. One particular aspect that deserves comment is the issue of dissolubility in marriage. There's an argument within Welle's book that talks about when does it become indissoluble, but the argument was centred on the place of the priest within the marriage order. They were wondering whether it was when the priest gave the nuptial blessing. Is this when indissolubility began? My point is, though, if you enter into the vulnerability of the state, indissolubility is not made with a wave of the hand, but it starts with the beginning of a relationship of committed love and grows towards a place where each spouse cannot imagine life without the other. That can take years. And in our current state, where over 50% of marriages in Australia fail, it's obvious that indissolubility was never reached. So for theologians to be arguing about it in terms of exactly which moment in the marriage celebration that occurs is bordering on the ridiculous. The other book that I'd like to refer to is called Parenting as Spiritual Practice and Source of Theology. Mothering Matters. This is edited by Claire Bischoff, Elizabeth O'Donnell Gandolfo, and Annie Hardison Moody. One of the chapters, Parenting Elders, Finitude, Gratitude and Grace, is written by Mary Elizabeth Moore, who at that time was the Dean of the School of Theology, Professor of Theology and Education, and Co-Director for Practical Theology at Boston University. Her theology is based on her own experience, which she declares right up front will be different to that of others, but each account is imbued with a rich meaning which is transferable. She examines the situation of caring for elderly parents and also her elderly husband through their dying journey, carefully forming a theology that's rich and transferable. Following the narrative that she presents, Mary develops theological themes that were evoked by the experience. She explores 3 of these themes in depth: finitude, gratitude, and grace. And her definition of grace is all abiding for me. She calls grace is God's heartbeat throbbing in the world. And our encounters with finitude force us to still ourselves and attune to that divine beat. That involves imagination, that involves being in that vulnerable place and imagining God being with you. This is theology that's wrought from a very real experience that interacts with the Trinitarian imprint which Pope Francis speaks. As with the Trinity, we live within a network of relations. Our God is relational, so we find our encounter with God through the relations that we have with other human beings. And other forms of creation as well. There are many who have wonderful experiences through the pets that are part of their lives. We must also work with other disciplines that will provide us with deep insights to the human condition to which we can respond. And of course, that again requires imagination. The cross-disciplinarity of which Pope Francis speaks is necessary as a development which is already evident in some areas, but it needs to be extended. And using one of your terms again, Beitor, this requires discernment. How do we do that? How do we remain in open conversation and enable the Spirit to speak through us? In paragraph 6, Pope Francis talks about the dialogue with other fields of knowledge, and that presupposes a dialogue within the ecclesial community. So there's a consciousness here that needs examining. If we're going to be synodal, then that closed shop attitude to which you referred, Beitor, earlier, of some theological gatherings needs to be opened up. The place of women needs to be welcomed and made viable. Conferences are valuable in the extension of ecclesial synodality, but need to be welcoming to all theologians, not just to clergy. Theology is dialogical, and so being open to many and varied approaches can only bring us closer to the truth. And in my reflection on all of this, coming closer to the truth is something that is much harder, I suppose, but also is much richer to keep that in mind. Also, Francis talks about the charity with truth being essential. In so many instances, we see scientific reason limited by its lack of faith in the 2 wings described by St. John Paul II in Ex Corde Ecclesiae. Faith and reason are both needed to let the light in for people to become the full measure of their humanity. As you said, Beitor, it's not detached from reality. Embrace and engage with the realities of our time. Francis talked about rethinking thought, and I really like that term. He talked about working it out on your knees, being pregnant with adoration and prayer, a very powerful image. These words really are evocative, and how much richer we will be when theology is open to the wounds of humanity. And like you, Francis, mentioned, being a field hospital, instead of being locked away in ivory towers and using Francis's term, to smell like the sheep. It means to move away from rewriting what's already been written and making expertise available to disciples living today. That'll be contextual theology. But to do that, we need to be on that synodal journey that's really where it's going to be able to happen. An understanding of Christ in the world needs to be inductive, not a response of the words already written. So let's be open to the questioning of a rapidly changing reality in a secularized world that no longer seems to talk about God as being relevant.
Thank you, Angela. That's a powerful response to Orobator's presentation. Thank you so much. I'd just like to say a few words of thanks to Father Orobator for his superb presentation this afternoon. I love the fact that you reminded us that the quest is, and that we're all on this quest, what kind of church is the Spirit inviting us to become? As simple as that. But in sharing the question with us this afternoon, you were eloquent, you were expressive, you were inspiring. You had a great clarity, and by just giving us a few concise ideas, you've left us with a sense of hope. We are all hungering for theology that matters to us, that it is meaningful and rooted in life. And today you've given us a great glimpse of that. Thank you very much for being with us for this afternoon. It's been a real pleasure to meet you virtually, and I hope we have the chance to meet face-to-face one day in the future. Thank you. And thank you to all who've helped make this Zoom happen this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. And I hope today has been, it's a true blessing to bring these webinars to you. And I think we've been blessed this afternoon with Andrea, who did a magnificent job with the moderation. For those of you who don't know, many, many questions. Rarely are those questions one-liners. They are often paragraphs upon paragraphs. And Andrea has done her very best to moderate and bring together a wide range of questions for you, Bator. So if your question specifically wasn't answered, please don't take offence. Andrea has done a wonderful job in synthesising those questions. And Angela, thank you very much for your response. If there's no such thing in Garratt world as a free webinar as such. So there's always a small message, if I may, from our sponsors, which in this case is me. Bator and our own Carmel Pilcher have contributed to this work, which is called Deep Enculturation. And Bator talked about encounter and encountering. And this book sort of lives up to the title in shifting the understanding and practice of enculturation from one-way limited process of insertion and putting our views together and putting our positions together to an encounter of mutual transformation. So we highly recommend this work. If you like what Bator had to say today, I am sure you will like this book, which he has contributed to. So there are a number of wonderful theologians and others who have contributed to this work. So please, if you wish, support that. If you don't want to buy it through Garratt, then please avoid buying it through Amazon. But if you don't want to buy it through Garratt, then please buy it through your local bookshop. So that might be St. Paul's or the Paulines. If we don't support our local bookstores in the country, we won't have local bookstores in the country, and we don't know what we will miss when we actually don't have them anymore. So it's my duty to, or my pleasure, my duty to close the webinar this afternoon. We have recorded the session and we will get a video out to all of you so that you can watch Bator and Angela and Andrea again. As I said, we're blessed, and I'm deeply I'm deeply grateful, and I honestly mean this, to all of you who consistently support these webinars, support the ACCCR, support the local Catholic reform movements, it's a very warm feeling as part of my mission to know that so many people want to continue to be part of church, whatever that looks like moving forward, regardless of the challenges that we have. So I look forward to the second iteration of the Synod in later this year, and the process is important, but I'm also looking towards the outcomes, as many people who are on this webinar are as well. So God bless you all. Thank you very much for attending today, and safe travels wherever you may. I guess you're heading back to the stateside at some stage, Batul. So your safe travels, and to everybody, please have a great night. Thank you very much.